Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what's making the headlines with the political editors of The Guardian and The Sun, Pippa Crerar and Harry Cole, who will be with us from now until just before midnight. Welcome to both of you. So to the front pages then, a shorter than usual selection. Explain why in a moment. The Mail reports that the International Monetary Fund is predicting that Britain will have the weakest growth of all the major economies this year, with output shrinking by 0.6%. The Metro leads with a denial from the Kremlin of an allegation by Boris Johnson that Vladimir Putin threatened to have him killed in a missile strike. The Times reports that schools face chaos over tomorrow's teacher strikes. That's tomorrow, meaning Wednesday. Of course, newspapers are a day ahead because unions have told their members not to say whether they'll be in work or not. The Sun carries allegations that a Chelsea footballer used a racial slur in a video on social media. The Financial Times International edition has word of the EU aiming to compete with US infrastructure investment by offering tax credits to be put towards green initiatives. And The Star, on a roll, you might say, with an in-depth report on the nation's lavatory paper preferences. Well, a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. Slightly fewer of them, as I said, because there is an embargoed story, so the papers aren't releasing them to us yet. Anyway, Pippa Crerar and Harry Cole are here. Let's kick off with what we have. Pippa, firefighters now voting for strikes. This is inside The Sun. Hold on a minute, I'm just checking it's not written by Harry. No, it's not. I'm OK to go to you. Yes, no end in sight, certainly, of this winter of discontent.
Yes, this is the latest public service to go on strike. We've obviously got the first teacher strike on Wednesday after talks with Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, broke down. We've got more rail strikes with both ASLEF and RMT later on this week. Wednesday in particular is a big day for walkouts because of there's basically coordinated action in response to the anti-strike legislation that the government so it's remaining stages in the Commons tonight. But the story in The Sun and across the other papers is the latest action, which is, of course, is the Fire Brigades Union, which is has balloted for strike action for the first time in 20 years. I mean, I'm old enough certainly to remember the Green Goddesses and the fact that the army was drafted in under the last time the firefighters went out on strike. And writing about that story then. The FBU is saying that they're walking out because basically they've had a 12% drop in real-term earnings since 2010, I think it is. No, sorry, yes, it's 2010, and that 1 in 5 firefighters' jobs has been cut. I mean, it's a story which is very familiar to us from other public services over the last few months. We've heard similar reasons being given by, for example, healthcare workers, nurses and so on, that they faced real terms cuts in their income. Obviously, with soaring inflation, those pay rises that they have received haven't kept up to pace with those. And they're really struggling out, many people, with the cost of living crisis. Other sectors as well. The health sector obviously is not just about pay, it's also about retention and the feeling that people don't want to work in the sector, which is obviously a huge problem for the NHS, which is facing many other problems at the moment. And in fire, with 1 in 5 jobs cut, there's a real feeling amongst firefighters that and the control room staff that they're basically having to do more for less when the pressure on them is increasingly intense. So it's, these strikes across the board are showing no sign of abating. The government strategy is just talking at the moment. We haven't seen that deal that we're expecting to come forward for health workers. It looks very much that like there's a stalemate in discussions, and we're not going to see any movement from either side soon.
Yes, well, teachers say their issue is retention too, not just pay, gaps in the system there as well. And the Times suggesting that actually it's really difficult for head teachers to plan on Wednesday because the union has asked teachers not to say if they are striking. I did put this to the National Education Union Joint General Secretary this evening. But anyway, Harry, tell us about the teachers and what was a half-hour meeting apparently with Gillian Keegan today.
Yeah, I mean, the government's line is currently holding that they're not going to reopen any pay negotiations from last week, from last year. Sorry, I think perhaps the idea that the unions are floating tonight. I think when you in your interview of perhaps a multi-pay year deal or discussing next year's pay, and perhaps a sort of minimum guaranteed rise for next year's pay negotiations, I suspect will be somewhere where a sort of landing zone is for these strikes, if there is going to be any breakthrough in talks, but no sign of that anytime soon. The government has sort of signalled they're willing to talk about next year's pay and perhaps speed up the pay review boards process, which begins really in sort of spring, where sort of Treasury set budgets and departments work out how much money they've got. That's then passed on to pay review bodies, who then negotiate and work out a pay offer. But obviously that's for next year. So this is sort of going to carry on rolling on. And as we saw with the fire brigades, this is quite contagious. Public sector strikes tend to be like that. If one sector sees perhaps if any movement on theirs, or perhaps getting a better deal, or even getting around the table, no sign of that yet, more and more sectors are going to strike. For the problem for the government, it seems to be a little bit like they're losing control. And this is why I think the legislation that's being debated in the House is needed, because the sort of sectors we're seeing now on strike are the blue light services, the firefighters and the ambulance drivers and nurses, and that minimum service legislation would bring us in line with our nearest socially progressive European neighbours that have stricter strike rules that basically say, yeah, you can walk out, sure, but you also can't leave people dying on the curb.
And yet people say, if you lose the power to withdraw your labour, you're no better than a slave. So that's why this is so. But you're
not losing the power to withdraw your labour. You're losing the power to withdraw your labour and make a protest. But also you're guaranteeing that if you work in a sector that is life dependent, you work out on your shift patterns how you make sure there is a minimum service. And I think it's very telling tonight, actually, that the teachers have joined the ambulance workers in being quite disruptive, the ambulance unions, that is, have been quite disruptive in leaving it right to the last minute to make it as hard as possible for contingency planning, to try and keep as many schools open and as many children in education as possible. Because don't forget, not all teachers are out. Not all ambulance drivers are out. Not everyone is striking. But those that do are trying to make it as hard as possible for services to continue, which kind of says it all in my view.
Yeah.
Well, I think the firefighters, the earliest we're likely to see strikes is the 23rd. And actually on the back of this ballot, they're going to go back and speak to their employers in the hope of striking a deal. So it's not like they're launching into immediate action. And I should just say that even though there is not a formal minimum service legislation, obviously that's what the government's trying to push through at the moment, across the health sector, in particular nurses and A&E staff, they volunteered their own minimum service requirements during those strikes days. And ambulance staff, who actually got a lot of flack for not coming up with a national collective minimum service level, which obviously would have been better to have a national one, but they did strike regional ones with their own NHS, their own individual NHS.
They left right the wire. They were haggling over it hours before the walkouts.
But regardless, they still put one in place. And what their argument is that if they can't strike, it is effectively withdrawing the right to strike, because they could potentially be sacked or sued by their employers should they do that. So it's effectively banning their right to strike and withdraw their labour. And
there are already restrictions. There are already restrictions.
The service is no better. Their argument is the service is no better currently at the moment than we had average waiting times of 90 minutes for an ambulance when the average should be 18 minutes. And it was on strike days. Their whole point is that they want the service to be safe, and currently it is unsafe regardless of whether they're striking or not.
It's a bit of a straw man argument when you're knowingly and willingly making the service worse to prove a political point.
Well, I think actually they responded to category 1 and 2 calls right across the country, which obviously category 1 is the heart attack, category 2 is the heart attack and stroke. Category 1 was unconscious, and that's what they would agree they do. And actually in some areas, and I'm sure you'll have seen this as well, Harry, we're talking to people on the ground across the country, but in some areas the ambulance service provided, precisely because they were conscious that they needed to make sure that it was well serviced, was better than it is on regular days when people have had to wait hours.
The army being sent into the army being sent to police borders better than border force was the other great example of that. Actually, the queues went down.
To be fair on the ambulance, they recognise recognise it's an operational picket line. That's how they describe it. And just on the substantive point in the Times as well, that schools can't plan after unions told members to keep their head teachers in the dark about whether they're taking part. The rules are the NEU is required by law to provide schools with the number of members that it is calling on to take strike action in each workplace. The union does not have to provide the names of members. I put it to Dr Mary Bousted, that makes it impossible for people to plan. You don't know if you've got a sports teacher or a chemistry teacher on. She said it has to be that way to prevent any intimidation to try to persuade people not to strike. So that's the reason it happens, she said.
Yeah, she would say that, though, wouldn't she? She's the one that's agitating and organising this. It's ridiculous. They are stretching their already pretty potted strike laws to the absolute limit. And if they were in any other European country, our nearest neighbours, be it France, Spain, Belgium and Holland, they would be under much stricter rules for striking. And no one's suggesting there's some sort of, South American dictatorship that doesn't allow trade unions. It's ridiculous.
So Harry, when might this minimum service level legislation actually pass, and will it stop any of these dates we've already got in? None
of these ones, no, because the government have dilly-dallied for years and months. This was a manifesto commitment in the 2015 election, I think, to do that. There was much tougher strike laws advocated by David Cameron in 2015 in his manifesto that he did a deal with the TUC to drop if they came out enthusiastically and backed his Remain campaign. So the government have only got themselves to blame for dithering over years, but in slightly better times when there were fewer strikes. We haven't really seen industrial action like this since the sort of 2011 and 2013 period. It all then sort of quietened off. All this legislation was put on the back burner or sort of dropped or negotiated away. And now the chickens have come home to roost and the government's playing catch up. OK, well, meantime, Rishi Sunak, in the Metro, we saw him in Darlington suggesting why he can't settle pay, which is because the real evil is inflation. Saying to the assembled audience there, Pippa, that if we have the same or similar levels of inflation in a year's time, no department will have any money to spend it. And yet he is putting a bit of money towards emergency care in the National Health Service, a 2-year plan for that, with a plan for primary care still to come. How do you think he did today?
Well, I listened in. I wasn't obviously in Darlington today, like some of my colleagues, but I listened in to his extensive Q&A with members of the audience who were primarily health workers. So we had community pharmacists and trainee nurses and various others that were sort of on the front line. And the consistent theme throughout was that they didn't have enough money to keep the services going. And I was very struck by the community pharmacist, who was the second person to ask a question. And of course, Rishi Sunak made the point that his mum was a community pharmacist, and pharmacists were very dear to his heart, and yet didn't really have any answers to the suggestion that the sector might basically was on its knees, and you're going to see pharmacies closing right across the country. I mean, there's a huge long-term systemic issue here, and that it's not just about cash. Obviously, what's being discussed at the moment is pay rises for staff that are really struggling, that have been struggling for years with real-term pay cuts, and it's also about retention of those staff in the health service. But there's also a broader systemic issue about the NHS, which, given our ageing population and the demands that have been placed on it with both the pandemic and flu over this winter, but pandemic over the last couple of years, increasingly is facing costs. And whether how you address those in terms of reform and what that reform looks like. And obviously you've got the Labour Party saying that they're prepared to use private hospitals in order to get those huge waiting lists down, but not beyond that. And the government is also striving to reduce waiting lists. And there's definitely sort of a bigger picture here, when on the one hand you have Steve Barclay saying that he wants to increase productivity of the NHS, presumably meaning the systems. But then, of course, there's people who are working right on the front line who interpret that as being, an attack on them, who are often working beyond their shift patterns. And if you're sort of on the front line in A&E or GP surgery, then you're really seeing, you're seeing everything. And them sort of feeling sort of under siege, really, from the government. And it's it's sort of a bigger picture than the sort of immediate one here.
But he did make the point, though. Yeah, he did make the point that more money is going into the NHS and social care than ever before. The pie is as big as it's ever been. But as you said, the demand, the pressure is certainly growing. But he was also asked, wasn't he, while he was up there, about how he handled the sacking of the party chair. Yes, I was swift to sack him. It was appropriate, etc. Harry?
Yeah, it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't that swift. He could have fired him a week before when it was clear that Nadhim Zahawi had misled at best numerous administrations in not declaring that he had paid this penalty. His statement that he put out, I think it was a week on Saturday ago, made pretty clear, and it was let it be known that he was, quote, livid with Nadhim Zahawi. Could have fired him then, but again went through the book, part of, I think, slightly as a party management tool, really, and he is a sort of stickler for the rules when he's not getting fined for eating cake and driving without a seatbelt on. But he claims to be a stickler of the rules and loves process. So I think he wanted to go through the motions of this new independent advisor, which is honourable in some ways, but also politically quite naive, because I think Downing Street realised pretty quickly over the weekend that another week of this and it's really going to start biting Rishi Sunak. So hence why we saw that extraordinary sort of 7 a.m. breakfast firing on Sunday morning. He got there in the end, let's put it that way.
Yes, and I just wonder, listening to him today and what you said about being politically naive, whether we're still seeing a Prime Minister who thinks like a Chancellor, Pippa.
Yes, well, he doesn't seem to have that political instinct that I think some of his predecessors have had. And, I think when you look at, for example, when he came in to power and he made that pledge that his government would be exemplified by professionalism, integrity, and I think it was accountability at every level. He felt that was really important to do to restore trust in the institution of government after the Boris Johnson era. And he was probably right. But the problem he's facing is that, his first 100 days, when he wants to be talking about bringing down NHS waiting lists and tackling small boats and anti-strike legislation and the economy, instead, he's having to divert a lot of airspace, a lot of oxygen, and a lot of political capital on dealing with a series of scandals, probity. So, we had Gavin Williamson getting sacked over bullying. Obviously, Dominic Raab, his Deputy Prime Minister, is under investigation for bullying allegations, and we're expecting the result of that very broad inquiry soon. And then the latest is, of course, Nadhim Zahawi. So he's struggling to get a hearing.
Yep. First 100 days. Is it this week? I've forgotten already. It was all a blur post-Liz Truss, wasn't it? Which day? Thursday. And it's the anniversary of Brexit tomorrow, isn't it? Quite a week for anniversaries.
How are you celebrating?
Could you be on tonight and not tomorrow? Anyway, lots coming up. Did Vladimir Putin really threaten to kill Boris Johnson? The former Prime Minister claims he did. We'll talk about that in just a moment. You are watching the press preview with me once again, Pippa Crerar and Harry Cole from The Guardian and The Sun. Harry, we go to the front page of the Metro. No time to lie. People probably heard the story already, but could you explain the story to us and where we're up to with it?
Yeah, I've been a proper spat, this one. Boris Johnson, in a documentary about the run-up to the Ukraine war, revealed in February last year, I think, one of his sort of 11th hour calls to the Kremlin, trying to convince Putin to not invade Ukraine. Obviously, lots of leaders were making these calls at the time. Sort of diplomatic sort of hopes were fading as those troop movements built up, if you cast your memory back to that time. And Johnson alleges, made a remark, whether it was a threat or some sort of sick joke, remains to be seen, of, if I wanted to kill you, I could do it with a missile in minutes. Now, obviously, Johnson is not the sort of thing that a prime minister or any world leader would say in office, but has let it slip to this documentary. Subsequently, now, the Kremlin have denied this, like they deny gassing children in Syria or the war crimes in Bucha, or indeed deny even calling the invasion of Ukraine a war. It's a special military operation. But such is the still long-running delusion and sort of derangement, anything to do with Boris Johnson and some parts of the media, That actually, you had Alistair Campbell today parroting the Kremlin lines, people siding with Putin over Johnson, which I think shows you just how far down the rabbit hole has gone. And I think it's quite astonishing, actually, that a paper as august and esteemed as the Metro have decided to parrot Kremlin propaganda on their front page for the sake of a cheap political point.
Well, on to another newspaper as august and with esteem too, the Daily Star. Talking about toilet roll, in fact. So popular in lockdown, it ran out. And now people are cutting back, it seems, Pippa, briefly.
Yes, well, I'm sure I wasn't the only one to have sort of several packets stashed on top of the wardrobe during the pandemic in case we ran out. Now it looks like it doesn't quite say why the Star. We've the cost of living crisis, is it, that we're all cutting back on?
Well, it seems to be fancy loo roll, as they put it. Yeah, fancy loo roll.
We're going for budget recycled instead, which sounds about right to me.
I hope it's not recycled loo roll. Recycled paper. Sorry, what did
recycled
I say
paper.
I'm going to stop. Both of you, time to go. Pippa Crerar and Harry Cole. Do apologise. Don't know what came over me.